How's that, David? Is that visible?
That's perfect.
Wonderful.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce James Davis, who's written an amazing biography of Eric Walrond. Really looking forward to hearing much more about him, the context in the Harlem Renaissance, and as you put in your title, him in exile in Wiltshire. So over to you, James. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's really nice to have everyone here. Thank you for joining for this discussion. I'm really grateful for the invitation to talk about intriguing writer, an intriguing person. I want to thank David and also thank his colleagues, Karen Jones and Amy Hammett, who contacted me over a year ago, I think it was, to be part of the museum's really ambitious set of projects around the history of Black Wiltshire, Black folks in Wiltshire. And I really wish I could actually be there in person. I had the opportunity to visit Wiltshire a couple of times in the past, including to speak about the book at the Bradford on Avon Library when it first came out. And it's wonderful, and I'm looking forward to coming back again. Um, it's impressive to see what the museum has done, especially with the exhibit that David spoke about, lest we forget, and to try to lift up the voices and the history of Black servicemen in the area in World War I, World War II. And I've appreciated just seeing what's online, appreciated the way that the museum is engaging the community and developing that exhibit. So it's really a privilege to be with you today and to be part of that broader effort to reconstruct some of the history of the region. It's delightful to me that you're planning a book club in February to talk about some of the work of Eric Walrond, the author, and it's very cool to see that part of the display and the exhibition that you have is the first edition of his book, Tropic Death, which has an inscription in the edition that you have, dedicated to his creative writing teacher at Columbia University. And David didn't mention it, but the museum commissioned a really nice portrait from a Jamaican painter, Mr. Clifton Powell. And if you haven't had a chance to visit the website yet, you should see Mr. Powell's really dynamic portrait of Walrond. It was thrilling to see that, and also to see, I have to commend Isaac Rawcliffe from the University of Winchester, who created some outstanding interactive digital materials about Eric Walrond and the New Negro movement, so to speak, which we'll talk about today. So again, thank you for being here and for the work that you're doing, not just to lift up this particular author, but the broader project about the history of Black residents and visitors to Wiltshire County. So let me begin by saying that the talk that I'm going to give today is drawn from the biography whose cover you're seeing on the screen right now that Columbia University Press published in 2015. It took me several years to write the book, and it was an absolute pleasure to be able to work on this book because, as you'll hear in the talk today, there were so many mysteries and puzzles to solve. The experience of working on it was both kind of literary analysis and biography, and also some sleuthing and mystery solving. I spent a lot of time in archives in different parts of the states and also in different countries, including some time in Wiltshire County. So I want to begin with the end and to say a little bit about how I got interested in the project and work backwards from there. You're seeing on the screen tombstone in Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington, north of London. And if you can make out the inscription, the epitaph tombstone, it says Eric D. Walrond, author, Tropic Death, 1898 to 1966. And I became interested in this author because in the previous book I had written, there was a chapter about a publishing company that began to publish the work of African-American writers in the 1920s. The name of the publisher was Bonnie and Liveright, and they were a small company in New York, but they were one of a few publishing companies that started to take some chances, take some risks on at the time in publishing new work by Black authors, and they put out 3 books in kind of rapid succession, including Tropic Death by Eric Walrond, and helped to galvanize interest in among North American readers in African American writers, and helped to sort of launch a new Negro movement and put out a lot of publicity around these authors. And Walrond was among the writers who uh, they published, and then from all accounts that I had read, sort of fell off the face of the earth. And there's a passage in, at that point, what was the definitive history of the New Negro movement, cultural history, called When Harlem Was in Vogue. And the way that the historian put it then was that Walrond was spotted in a train station in London in 1929, and that was about the last anyone ever heard of him. And I thought, well, that's strange. His book, Tropic Death, is really interesting. He was clearly, from all accounts, an important author, and also sort of midwife, so to speak, of this movement in arts and letters in North America that came to be known as the Harlem Renaissance, or as you all say it, Renaissance. And then he just disappeared after 1929. And the book itself was fascinating to me. And the mystery of his disappearance was, or putative disappearance, was fascinating to me. And the more I read, the more I saw that, in fact, he didn't disappear, and that other scholars had tried to pursue him to wherever he left. And the more I poked around and studied and looked in archival materials, the clearer it became that there was a much longer story here about the distance that he traveled from leaving New York City and the New Negro movement in 1929, and his death here and burial in Abney Park Cemetery in 1966. So that's what set me off on the story. And I want to point out that this was his residence from 1939 to 1952 in Bradford-on-Avon in Wiltshire. And we'll talk a little bit more today about what he was doing there, how he came to be there, and what he attempted to write and publish, and where he went from there. But I took these photos, and I can't remember which time I was visiting, but at least the architecture, if not the actual house itself, will be familiar to anyone from Wiltshire. This is number 9 Ivy Terrace, where he rented a set of rooms from 1939 to 1952. And I want to say a little bit more about what he was doing there. I included this bit of this letter because you can see the return address at the top from number 9 Ivy Terrace. And it's written to, and I won't spend time reading the entire letter, but the recipient of the letter is the Secretary General of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. And he was writing in the late spring of 1940 to the Guggenheim Foundation to assure them that he was in fact working on the project that they had funded him starting in the late 1920s. They had given him funding, and we'll talk about the project he was working on. But the last sentence of this letter, I think, is instructive for us, and the way that he signs off the letter. He's writing to Henry Allen Moe, the General Secretary, and he says at the end that even now, with everything more insecure than ever before, all my energies are being directed towards one end, namely to produce something which would, in some small measure, justify the confidence which the foundation so generously reposed in me 12 years ago! Exclamation mark, believe me, yours faithfully, Eric Walrond. So, I mean, there's a bit of the conventional florid, I suppose, prose, but also some, and we'll come back to this, some of the self-reproach almost that he feels at not having completed project that the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation had funded him to set out to complete. So that reproach is something I hope we can return to later, but I wanted to point this out not only because of the location of the address that it was sent from, but also to forecast. He describes himself in the middle of this letter as a depression casualty with some ups and downs, which turns out to have a double entendre, as we'll talk about later. Who was this person? You wouldn't have known it because from all accounts, as a resident of number 9 Ivy Terrace, he did not, speak about himself as a famous writer, or ever having been a famous writer. But the fact is that that in the 1920s, in New York, and to some extent beyond New York, he had established himself as a person of letters in nonfiction and fiction. The portrait that you see here comes from a publication that was called The New Negro, which is sometimes credited in histories of the period as kind of high water mark in cultural expression that was known as the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro movement in arts and letters. The fact that his portrait appeared in the New Negro anthology, published in 1925, is a testament to his prominence already in 1925. He had arrived in New York City, moved to Brooklyn from Panama, which we'll talk about later, as a journalist and an aspiring writer, had already made somewhat of a name for himself by 1925, even before he published the book Tropic Death, which would become sort of his calling card. The New Negro movement in American literature, I don't want to presume any knowledge. I also don't want to talk, I don't want to talk over what people on this call may already know, but by the post-World War I period, there had been a tremendous migration of African Americans out of the South for various reasons, including economic and also the violence towards Black people in the South, Ku Klux Klan, et cetera. And the cities in the North, including and especially, but not only New York City, became kind of institutional and also just demographically vibrant space for Black families, not only from the South, but including and especially swelled by migrants from the South. And it also, as it turns out, from the West Indies. So you see on the left side of the screen here an issue of a magazine that was a periodical, monthly, called The Survey. And they had, I think it was a weekly, and they published a monthly graphic version. You see on the screen here in 1925, kind of vibrant, Africanist iconography, with a tenor singer on the cover named Roland Hayes. And on the right side of the screen, again, the iconography is very gripping and intended to have a kind of Africanist resonance. The New Negro, and this was the anthology published in 1925, the attempt to collect various forms of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and visual art to inaugurate a movement. Walrond was absolutely central to not only contributing to, in terms of being a writer to that movement, but also to being a shaper and a publicist and promoter and a mover of the movement. This is a photograph of the parade in Harlem in 1924, and I included it because it has this sign in the middle of the parade. It's a Universal Negro Improvement Association parade that went through Harlem and announced at the front of this car that the New Negro has no fear. And so the sensibility, especially with servicemen coming back from having served their country in World War I, coming back to the United States and experiencing tremendous racism and prejudice, where they do not have the equal rights in the United States, which they had just gone abroad to defend, in some cases to die for. The sensibility of the movement was more militant, and it comes across as well in some of the writing at the time. And the Universal Negro Improvement Association was led by a Jamaican immigrant by the name of Marcus Garvey, who may be familiar to some on this talk today. And he also edited a magazine called Negro World, which was essentially the outlet of the UNIA, and it was the first publication that Eric Walrond worked for and wrote for in a consistent way when he arrived from Panama in 1919. It was a militant Black nationalist movement and a militant Black nationalist organ of the organization. The second publication that Walrond went to work for was not as militant, and it was not Black nationalist, and it was led by a sociologist who had been trained at the University of Chicago named Charles Johnson. But like the Negro World, Opportunity, and the Crisis, which was the NAACP organ and monthly magazine, they all set about to promote arts and letters in the 1920s in a way that was new. And even though they had a slightly different sensibility and political orientation, they were all committed to lifting up the voices of Black writers and artists. And Eric Walrond took a job in the early 1920s with Charles Johnson and Opportunity Magazine as the business manager of all things. And he also traveled and wrote essays and published fiction in Opportunity as well. He was given the task of editing a special issue. I just thought this would be of interest to people attending this talk. Opportunity published a special issue in November 1926 devoted to the Caribbean, and Eric Walrond was the guest editor for that entire issue. And in 1926, he pulled together stories that he had been at work writing and publishing here and there into a book. Sometimes people mistakenly refer to it as a novel. I don't think of it as a novel, even though it hangs together thematically. But the book Tropic Death came out in 1926. It was republished several times over the years, but most recently after it was out of print for a long time by Norton in 2013. And that's the cover that you have here. And I thought it'd be worth spending a couple of minutes talking a little bit about the reception of the book and also the language of the book. I'm an English professor. I'm not going to talk at length about the themes of the book. You should read it. If nothing else, I hope that the talk inspires you to read Tropic Death. I'll just say that as the title suggests, it's a fairly lugubrious book. I think that there's at least one death, if not more, in each of the stories. I'm not going to spoil the stories themselves, but they are fairly grim. They're, I think, also fascinating. And it was the first book by a Black writer in the United States about the Caribbean. And if nothing else, and I think there's other reasons why it's a significant book, but if nothing else, as a first, I think it's an important book. And I think that's why Bonnie and Liveright decided to publish it. It was promoted widely, both in Black publications and periodicals and beyond. And you can see on the left side of the screen some of the terms in which the book was promoted. Eric Walrond's book has just been published. It takes us deep into the life of the American tropics. I think that phrase itself is kind of interesting. The American tropics. Its stories of Black and white, of jungle, river, and the Caribbean shore are true, vivid, unsentimental, and present a section of Negro life never touched before. And without dilating too much on this, the term unsentimental is really interesting in the history of American literature, and especially the history of African-American literature, because the attempt to distance modernist writing in the early 20th century from sentimental writing is very self-conscious in the minds of authors and certainly of promoters of authors at the time. The attempt to move away from tropes and themes of so-called sentimental writing in the 18th and 19th century. So particularly as they relate to what was sometimes called the plantation tradition in African American literature, and the stereotypes and thematic treatment, sentimental thematic treatment of Black characters. On the right side of the screen, I just included this in there because you see blurbs from different authors that appeared in the promotions for the book. Carl Van Vechten, John Dos Passos, others. Here's Tropic Death being sold for $2.50. And I always like this one, the New Yorker promotion of the book, sort of 2/3 of the way vertically down the page here being promoted. You have a Dreiser novel, a Theodore Dreiser novel at the top. I don't know how widely known or read anymore Theodore Dreiser is in England, but a kind of canonical author in American naturalism, on a lot of syllabi, at least, if not on bookshelves anymore. The American Tragedy, the highbrow book at the top, and then at the bottom, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which was really the bestseller by this in 1926 by this publishing company. And somewhere in between, you have Tropic Death. The book to which it was most often compared was another African-American writer, or a writer who's really of multiple races, but who passed for Black when it was helpful to him and to his publishing company, Gene Toomer. And there are lots of different reasons why Tropic Death was compared to this book, Cain. But I wanted to just point out that if, Cain is much better known, I would say, but only recently. Because like many authors from the Harlem Renaissance, whether Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, Gene Toomer, or others, it has taken a process of recovery and to rekindle interest in the writing, and that's certainly true for Gene Toomer and Cain, and it's absolutely true for the author we're talking about today, Eric Walrond. Thought it would be worth just flagging a couple of blurbs from contemporaries, critics. One, Alain Locke was the editor, among other things, was the editor of the New Negro Anthology, was a philosophy professor at Howard University, who may have done more than any single individual to usher in and promote a movement and market, to put it in crude terms, to market a movement that was called the New Negro Movement. And the way that he promoted and praised this author was to say Eric Walrond has a tropical color and almost volcanic gush that are unique even after more than a generation of exotic word painting by master artists. And some of you will have heard of W.E.B. Du Bois, who led among other things, led the NAACP, National Association for Advancement of Colored People, a prolific author himself, who called Tropic Death, quote, a distinct contribution to Negro American literature, a document of deep significance and great promise. So here we have, and this was the cover photograph from my book, Eric Walrond, I think around in his early 20s, decorated, promising, charismatic, handsome, talented, a man about town. If you came to Harlem from any other part of New York City, or you came to New York City from any other part of the United States, and you wanted to know what was going on in Harlem, USA, people would eventually direct you to Eric Walrond because he could show you where all the speakeasies were, where the jazz clubs were. He was writing about this Renaissance in art and letters and helping to promote it from his various institutional perches. What happened next? I should say first, who was he, right? And I think the fascinating thing to me was, in fact, he was not, I would not say he was African-American except by acculturation, because in fact, he came from and wrote about the West Indies, and specifically mostly about the Caribbean, and about Panama during the canal construction. He spent most of his childhood, formative years, adolescence in the Panama Canal Zone, and specifically spent grew up in this street featured here in a kind of grainy resolution. I apologize for that. In a street called Bottle Alley. And on the right side, you see the departure and boats waiting in the distance in the harbor in Georgetown, Barbados, because at this point and during Walrond's youth and adolescence, many, especially men, but not only men from Barbados were headed to the Panama Canal Zone to work either for the canal construction company or on the canal itself. And that was the case with Eric Walrond's father, and his family followed. And that's where he grew up, and that is where he wrote about. Those are the stories that are featured in Tropic Death. I use this slide. I'm going to skip over it for this audience because a lot of uh, North Americans don't know anything about the Caribbean, but you'll see on the far right of the screen that Barbados, which is where Walrond's parents were from, where his family was from, where he spent a little bit of his childhood, is the easternmost windward island. And you'll see sort of on the left, bottom left of the screen, the location of Panama and the canal zone. On the very bottom right, you can see Georgetown, which was actually where Eric Walrond was born in the British colony of Guyana, British Guyana at the time. He was born there because his parents went there also looking for work. His father was a tailor. So he was, but just by point of fact, born in British Guyana, lived in Barbados, child of Bajan parents, and then spent most of his adolescence in Panama, where he graduated school and learned a trade of journalism. I wanted to point out that one of the signature features of his book, Tropic Death, and I want to just stop talking for a minute so you can hear in your mind's ear, so to speak, the way that his dialogue in the book sounds, the way that he marked the words in order to make them sound different from quote unquote standard written English. So I'm going to stop talking for a second so you have a minute to hear what these words sound like in your ear as he wrote them. This is from a story called Panama Gold in Tropic Death. Okay, and now even if you're not finished, I think you can get the idea and you can see how it takes a while to become accustomed to reading dialogue that's marked in this way. And I want you to also notice in the last paragraph, even if you can't follow every single word, you can see that the dialogue has to do with an insult that one of the characters has received, where he's giving an account of saying back to his friend that he rejected being called the N-word or the bloody N-word because he said, I'm an Englishman. Big distinction in that. So maybe that's something that will be of interest when we have a chance to talk after the slides. He's saying I'm an Englishman and not a bloody American N-word. This is another bit of dialogue. This is an exchange between two women. Again, actually about one of them feeling very insulted about the conduct of the other woman's daughter. So I'll stop again so you can try to take in some of this dialogue. I'm not even going to try to read it. I think it's better if you just try to sound it out yourself. Okay, so uh, I- I'm not sure how much you can make out here, but as you can see by the last two sentences alone, um, one of them is telling her friend Lizzie that, children these days are just getting worser and worser. And the other one says that when when the father comes home, he's going to beat the young girl, Miss Cappadocia. Okay, so this is this is the way that much of the dialogue of the book looks, and you can see how stylized it is, and the great effort that the author went to in order to try to be faithful, I suppose one could say, to the sound of the vernacular, the patois, the dialect um, of the of the characters. And I thought it would also be interesting for those who haven't read the book to see that when it comes to the narrative parts of the book, there's a equally stylized, I would say, but very different approach to the writing. And this I will read just because I won't butcher the sound of the words when I read them. The sun had robbed the land of its juice, squeezed it dry. Here, I need to actually move something, sorry. Squeezed it dry. Star apples, sugar apples, husks, transparent on the dry, sleepy trees. Savagely prowling through the orchards, blackbirds stopped at nothing. Turtle doves rifled the pods of green peas and purple beans and even the indigestible Brazilian bonavis. Potato vines, yellow as the leaves of autumn, severed from their roots by the pressure of the sun, stood on the ground, the wind's eager prey. Undug, stemless, peanuts, carrots, seeking balm, relief, the caress of a passing wind, shot dead, unflustered eyes, up through the sun-etched cracks in the hard, brittle soil. The sugar corn went to the birds. So I won't make observations about this for the sake of time, but certainly if people want to talk after the slides are finished, I think there's a lot one could say about the style of the writing. And those of you who are familiar with other, I suppose, modernist writers in the English or Anglo-American tradition will see and hear resonance between the style of these sentences and some of what we find in other authors, other writers in the 1920s, both on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond. But that's all I really wanted you to hear and to see about this. Sorry. Okay, so when I move on, because I want to get over to your side of the pond, what happened next was that this author who had made a splash and made something of a name for himself in the New Negro movement and beyond, received two somewhat prestigious awards and remunerative awards in quick succession. And he set out to write his next book, which was to be entitled The Big Ditch, about the history of the Panama Canal, and particularly from a perspective kind of from the ground up, right? There were at the time many histories of the Panama Canal, but they took a different approach from the one that Walrond wanted to write. And I've somewhat abbreviatedly called it anti-colonial history here, because from the perspective of someone from the Caribbean islands and who grew up during the canal construction, from the perspective of the people in the region. And so he set out to, he had already in fact started this, and the Guggenheim Foundation said, this is a promising looking young writer and an author with a new take on the history of an important development in the Western Hemisphere. So we're gonna fund him to travel through the Caribbean. And that was his proposal. And he spent a year traveling in the Caribbean and doing research and writing and giving talks, and wound up not wanting at all to come back to the United States, where he had I guess what I would describe as a very ambivalent experience, both of racism and also of acceptance as a prominent author. And he said, you know what, I'm going to try my luck, as many other authors did, in France, especially African-American performers, certainly musicians, artists at this time. And like many of his friends and contemporaries, said, I want to go to France and continue to write my book. For the sake of time, I'm going to kind of rush through some things, and because I want to get to the English portion of the presentation. But this was the Depression, and the publishing company that had in fact signed a contract with him in 1928, 29 to publish The Big Ditch, backed out of the contract, canceled the contract. Like a lot of publishing companies that were, not flourishing already, they folded. I mean, they really struggled to make it through the Great Depression and canceled the contract. Walrond was furious. He wrote angry letters from all parts of France where he was, trying to make ends meet as a starving artist, and could not get Horace Liveright, who I would not call a paragon of integrity under any circumstances. But Horace Liveright was figuring out how to close down his publishing company or hand it off to Albert Bonney, who was his partner, and acquit himself of gambling debts. And so Eric Walrond took a boat back across the ocean, had a big fight, and got lawyers involved to say, how dare you cancel the contract for The Big Ditch, and did not come out on the winning end of that argument, and so really struggled. And we'll talk later about the struggles that he had just in terms of his own mental health and stability, his own certainly financial stability. But losing the contract for this second book at a point in his career that very, very few African American writers at the time ever reached to begin with, where they ever reached a point where they said, I may be able to quit my job and become a writer. No one could do that. Not even the most prominent African American writers at the time managed. I mean, Du Bois managed, Langston Hughes managed. Hardly any other African American author at this period managed to quit their day job and become a writer. Walrond was sort of on the cusp of almost being able to do this, and this dashed his hopes, and he struggled, did not want to move back to the United States, had only really lived in New York for 10 years, and was deeply disillusioned both by the racism he encountered and now also this blow at the Depression era to his career. He struggled in France and thought that maybe some of the contacts he had in England, as you know, he was from the British West Indies, so he had some contacts in what was at that point, I don't know if I would say burgeoning, but emerging Black British writing movement, which had not yet, I would not say it had not yet taken the form of that it later would when authors such as Naipaul and Lamming and George Padmore, Jean Rhys and others were able to publish novels. There were very few novels at this point, but what there was a kind of a vibrant anti-colonial, somewhat diffuse, but periodical culture, a really vibrant periodical culture. And so when Eric Walrond moved to London in the 1930s, again, to continue to try to work on his history of the Panama Canal, he began to publish and move in different circles, including ironically, kind of reconstituted Garveyite movement. So you see on the list here, this is not an exhaustive list, but if anybody is interested in what Eric Walrond published in terms of race relations and anti-imperialist movement writing in the 1930s, these would be suggestions that I would offer, and these are available in different places. Black Man was a publication that Marcus Garvey's organization reconstituted in London temporarily in the 1930s, and I won't go into the history, some of you may know it, but Garvey was deported from the United States. They charged him, I mean, there was a terrific investigation, and by terrific, I mean in not in a positive sense, but in the scope. FBI investigation that got Marcus Garvey deported. He was widely considered a tremendous threat to American democracy, and because of his Black nationalism. And they found they were able to deport him ultimately on a kind of a trumped up charge of mail fraud. And he was deported back to Jamaica and found his way to London, where he attempted to reconstitute the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which always had a transnational reach and aspirations. And Walrond worked for the Black men in the UNIA briefly in 1930s. But there's also a really interesting essay called White Man, What Now? That Walrond published in The Spectator, which some of you on this meeting will know goes way, way, way back to the 18th century, Addison and Steele. And that essay is kind of fascinating to me and was picked up by the main kind of periodical out of Kingston, Jamaica at the time, The Gleaner. So I say all that just to relocate this conversation in England finally, and to point out what Walrond was working on then, writing stories, but able to only publish nonfiction essays. By the time the Second World War reached England, and there's this first essay on this list here is a kind of chronicle of Walrond experience when the evacuation orders came through in London, and he was one of, as folks here know better than I do, thousands of evacuees who wound up on trains, dispatched overnight, and then some in haste to Wiltshire and other parts of outside of London. So he ended up in a train that was bound for a place he had certainly never heard of before, and landed in Bradford-on-Avon. As I said at the start of the talk, the first essay is about that experience of being evacuated as the war clouds gathered. And I make this list here because I want to point out that while he was resident in Bradford-on-Avon, he continued to write The Big Ditch, and also, in order to try to pay some bills, to write about Black Britain, and specifically about, I think, about elements of, I would say, the color bar is the way that he referred to it, about the type and extent of racial prejudice in England, and also about servicemen, Black servicemen from the West Indies who were enlisted in the Royal Air Force and the RAF, and also about Black American servicemen who were stationed, in fact, right locally in the area in segregated U.S. troops, racially segregated U.S. troops. So you see the byline here on this list is the New Amsterdam News. Amsterdam News is one of the most prominent African-American periodicals, certainly in the New York periodical culture, if not the whole United States. So he was sending these articles from number 9 Ivy Terrace back home, so to speak, or what was, I guess I would say now in exile, someone quite uprooted and peripatetic at this point, back to New York. Also, somewhat later, but I think worth noting, also writing essays and articles, again, broadly now about, I would say, international anti-colonial developments, movements, policies. He was really fascinated by the Ethiopian uprising. He saw that, as many, as many observers and writers did at the time, as a kind of watershed moment in the resistance and independence uprisings of African independence movements and beyond, against European, British, and other imperial projects. He wrote here very much about the kind of diaspora, fascinated, as you see here, by the education and training of, as he put it in the title here, Negroes and Indians in Britain, British colonial policy in Africa, and the so-called color bar in Great Britain. And these articles were sent also, again, back from Bradford-on-Avon to his old boss and editor, Charles Johnson, who was now the editor of a publication called the Monthly Summary, and was the chair of a department at a historically Black university in Tennessee. So I'm not sure if I'm talking too literal or too much, but I'm mindful about the time. And so I want to move as quickly as possible through the rest. This may be of interest to this audience. You know, he began writing stories, and these are, I would say, I wouldn't call them fiction, but they take the form of short stories. And this is just a kind of suggestive list so that you can see the location and some of the themes. You know, he was very interested in the kind of tensions and cross currents between race, ethnicity, nation, and color, or colorism, the color bar. And here are some of the titles that and the locations of some of the stories. These are actually anthologized, and they're if for anyone who's interested, and I know David has made some PDFs of things that were published in Roundway Review, which I'll get to next. But it is possible at this point to get access to some of these stories, which were, I guess, until recently, you could call them quite fugitive. They were not at all prominently published. And precisely because he struggled so much to place his publications, Walrond had to work. He worked in Melksham at the rubber factory. And I wasn't able in my research to specifically identify which factory. I looked for employment records and things like that. But I don't know, Amy, if it was you or others who actually chased down employment records that show that he worked at the rubber factory in Melksham. Melksham, am I saying that? I don't know if I'm pronouncing anything right, but he worked there for several years. But he increasingly suffered from depression and wound up checking himself in. He was not a compulsory patient, but the Roundway Psychiatric Hospital in Devizes at that point had a program for voluntary patients, and he moved and admitted himself to this hospital quite, I would say, should I say, separated really from family. He did have a wife and children, but he had already severed ties with them many years earlier. Had really, and I think that the letter that I read from early on that expressed this sense of self-reproach at not having lived up to his obligations, or certainly to the aspirations that he had established for himself, maybe in the minds of others, struggled both financially and also with what we would describe now as clinical depression. So he admitted and lived on the grounds in the Roundway Psychiatric Hospital, which now physically, many of you know this already, but for those of you who don't, physically still occupies a really gorgeous setting in the outskirts of Devizes, but is now, I think, condominiums. Now, he was well enough during that time to continue to be active and creative and make constructive use of his time. And he helped to establish a literary magazine, or really a magazine that was inclusive of literature and essays, but went beyond that. And this is, I think, interesting and important, and kind of illustrative of the kind of person that he was, which was industrious, even at a somewhat impaired state. This is the cover of the Roundway Review, Volume 4, so in its fourth year, and it's got aerial photograph of the grounds of the hospital, around the Roundway Hospital, and 1956, May 1956. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that Eric Walrond became the editor of the Roundway Review, and it's a real document, and you can see the full run of the Roundway Review if you go to the library. I think it's the Devises Library Museum. Maybe it's combined. That's where I saw it anyway. And I'm not going to read what's on the page here, but just to point out that what Eric Walrond did was he took his manuscript of The Big Ditch, or some version of it, because I think it probably existed in a few different forms. And he retitled it, one version of it, he retitled it The Second Battle, and published it in 15 serialized installments, again, very enterprising, in the Roundway Review. I mean, look, if you're going to be the editor of the literary magazine at a mental hospital, you should at least use it to showcase your work. And I think what's fascinating here, I mean, one, it's great because now we can, those of us who are interested in these kinds of things, have some documentation, not the whole thing, of this, what was going to be an anti-colonial history of the Panama Canal construction, from the French efforts all the way through the American. But also what you see on the screen here, that, without reading it too closely, an incredible juxtaposition that I think is really illustrative. On the right side of the page is a somewhat dense prose, which is footnoted and, as if it's an academic book or article. And on the left side of the screen is a more breezy account of a visit that the residents of the Roundway Psychiatric Hospital took to animal sanctuary in nearby Fern. And again, I don't know, Fern Shaftesbury in Dorset. Okay, the Fern Animal Sanctuary in Dorset. We reached the sanctuary at 3:50 p.m. The lady and superintendent welcomed us. We went to the dog kennels, et cetera, et cetera. Other pages, if you go through the magazine, have, various accounts of visits to other locations. The game of badminton that the residents played against the staff one day. Here's what's going on in the kitchen. Here's what's going on in devices this month. Here's a word search that you could do. Here's a crossword puzzle. The juxtaposition to Eric Walrond's, again, highly researched project about the history of the Panama Canal is striking. Winding things up, why did Walrond end up leaving Roundway Hospital, and did he ever write or do anything ever again? The short answer is yes, and it's because of his old friends, Langston Hughes, with whom probably some of you are familiar as a poet and, again, longstanding anthologist and promoter of not just African-American poetry and writing, but broadly international Black writing. But his other friend, Nancy Cunard, who's less well-known, British heiress to the Cunard shipping fortune, who happened to also have taken a keen interest as a younger person. This is a 1938 photograph of Hughes and Cunard talking to one another, and she edited a tremendous anthology, quite an ambitious anthology, that students of Black history, cultural history, and literature will know about, simply titled Negro, in the 1930s. And Walrond managed to get connected, again, just through letter writing, back through Langston Hughes and Nancy Cunard, who put him in touch with a woman named Erica Marks, who was the editor of a small press in Kent, as you can see on the right side here. And Erica Marks was also, again, kind of a pioneering small press publisher who was engaged at the time in research in African-American poetry and Black poetry more broadly. And she wanted to collaborate on a theatrical performance of Black poetry in London. Walrond was enlisted as the researcher, not the writer, but the researcher for that performance, and which ended up being among the first, if not the first, performance of African-American poetry on the stage in London's West End. And I don't know if the typeface is large enough, but you can see Royal Court Theatre, Sloane Square, some of the performers who gave readings and performances of fairly long roster of, as it's called here on the cover, a program of Negro poetry. Also, and then anthologized by the Hand and Flower Press, which was Erica Marx's press, and sold for 3 shillings. And somewhere in England, at least at the University of Sussex, if not elsewhere, you can get copies of Black and Unknown Bards. I'm going to wrap up. At this point, I'm gratified to be able to say that Eric Walrond's writing is available in anthologies already in 1998. A couple of scholars, one from here in New York, Long Island University, doing a lot of collaboration and a lot of the archival work to resurface the research that certainly that went into my book. Collaborated on an anthology that's on the left side of the screen from 1998, published that reader. And then in 2011, another iteration of Walrond's writing called In Search of Asylum, which anthologized later writings, including many of the essays and stories that I mentioned in the second part of my talk. And then also really gratifying to see how much kind of critical interests of scholars, Caribbeanists and North American and British and other scholars and readers really interested in Walrond's writing beyond, not only in Tropic Death, but beyond. So on the left side of the screen, a book that came out in 2013, collection of essays, critical essays, published by the University Press of the West Indies. And then, of course, the best book of all on the right side of the screen. So let me thank not only everybody who's here coming today, but I wouldn't have been able to do the research that I did when I visited Wiltshire County if it weren't for the Wiltshire Library Service, if it were not for very genial, generous phone call with Iris Millwood. I don't know what Iris Millwood is up to any longer, but when I visited and had no leads whatsoever, she was very kind to the Bradford and Avon Visitor Center in saying, well, oh, you came all the way here from New York, you should probably talk to these people. And among the people I spoke with and was able to record audio interviews with were residents of Wiltshire, some of whom are no longer with us, John Cottle, Gerald Bodman, Mary Lane, and Patrick Scarborough, who was at the time the owner and resident of number 9 Ivy Terrace. And I have to express gratitude every time I talk about Eric Walrond, especially the time that he spent in Wiltshire County, because I had no idea that anyone living in Wiltshire County would have ever heard of him, much less have spoken to him or met him. So I benefited greatly in trying to piece together the puzzle pieces of my biography from speaking to those residents. They were generous with their time. And last but not least, the Wiltshire Museum and the Wiltshire Swindon History Center for archival and other conversations. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I want to thank you all for your generosity and patience. And I have not been able to read the chat as I've been talking. So forgive me, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James. Absolutely fascinating. So now is a good chance for you to start thinking of the questions you'd like to ask James. But perhaps I can go first because I have a very privileged position. Not so much a question, but more of a reflection. Is that we know quite a lot about the way that that patients were treated in the hospital at Roundway, and one of the key things is that a lot of the treatment was around making sure that people are engaged, getting them things to do, to involve themselves in. And I think that sort of is behind that juxtaposition of we went on this trip with Eric's really quite erudite writing, and very much that he was trying to, the hospital was encouraging people to develop their interests as a way of combating their mental illness. I found that absolutely fascinating.
My understanding, and others here may know more, is that the British quote unquote asylum system had just gone through a kind of progressive reform in which what had been administered as fairly aggressive, almost medieval types of treatments, including confinement and all kinds of very aggressive approaches that would now seem quite horrifying, and had over time given way to more what we would call therapeutic treatments. And the main administrator of the Roundway Psychiatric Hospital, which had been called I think the Wilts Asylum, if I'm not mistaken, until not too long before that, the administration of the hospital was quite progressive, and as you say, sought primarily to engage. And there was an enormous, an enormous number of patients and residents at the hospital. I don't remember offhand now, but it's in the thousands. I want to say 2,000 patients and residents there. Intentional effort, as you said, to try to engage them in constructive play, constructive work, engagement. So it's no accident that, as you say, trips and things like that, but also the creation of a magazine, of a literary magazine for and by the patients in collaboration with the staff.
I wonder if anyone has any questions. I'm just going to put in the chat now the information about the book club event, because two of the stories that you mentioned that appeared in the Roundway Review, that's the Lieutenant's Dilemma and The Strange Incidents. Those are two of the stories that are in the downloadable pack that you can read, so you can sort of experience Eric's writing for yourselves. And his insights into life in Britain at the time as someone who was not white is really fascinating. I found it really interesting.
I think I'll be interested to know, as residents of the area, probably many of you whose families go back generations, residents of Wiltshire, what you end up making if you haven't already read some of his reflections about the question of color, race relations. There's a great deal in his writing about the question of sort of the politeness of English culture, which was very different from what he experienced in New York. And of course, as an immigrant to both New York and then to the UK, he had kind of outside perspectives of both. And I don't think he would characterize the culture of New York City in the 1920s as restrained and polite. But he did experience the UK in that way, at least in Wiltshire County. But that intersected for him in some really fascinating ways with what he certainly felt as a kind of at least racial uneasiness, if not overt racial discrimination. So those observations I found to be really intriguing. And I won't say that they're accurate. I'll say they're one person's experience, but that's where I would be very curious.
But it was his experience. So yes. Yeah. We've got Antonia who has raised her hand, so I'll actually allow her turn her microphone on as long as she's happy, and allow her to talk. So here we go. Hello, Antonia. You should be able to talk now.
I didn't intend to raise my hand. I don't know what I did.
Oh, right. Okay. Don't worry. Thank you. So we've got a question from Trixie who says, do we know what happened to his family?
I do. I will give you the short version. He, in New York, he married a young woman who was also an immigrant from the Caribbean, from Jamaica. Her name was Edith Cadigan. They had a relatively brief, and from his accounts of it, not entirely blissful few years of marriage in which they had 2 daughters and one on the way when they split up. Again, also, all of this in New York. She moved with the daughters back to Jamaica, I think when she was still pregnant with their third child, remarried. And in fact, I've had the opportunity to speak with and correspond with several of his descendants, not the daughters, although I did meet one of them when she was extremely elderly, living in a suburb of New York in North Jersey. But I've had the opportunity to speak with some of his and correspond with some of his granddaughters. They're all over the States and Jamaica, in fact. They are ambivalent about their father, who did not do right by their mother or grandmother, as the case may be, they feel. But they are also gratified and pleased to see a recovery of a prominent Caribbean writer who had not received his due in his lifetime and who frankly died, I don't want to say penniless, but in very modest conditions of a heart attack in this North London suburbs in 1966, with very little recognition of his talents or the prominence that he had achieved in one of the signal cultural movements in the United States, and I would say in the global Black diaspora. So they, in terms of the family, I think there's, and those who I've been back in touch with, there's, I think, a kind of bittersweet sense of recovery of their grandfather, slash relative, as the case may be. One of his daughters went on to be a prominent diplomat from Jamaica. So.
Interesting. And I know he dedicated the 1966 reprint of Tropic Death to his daughters after being reconciled with them, didn't he?
Yeah, and one of them in the course of her diplomacy or diplomatic training visited him in the early 1960s when he lived in London. So.
And Catherine has asked, can you remind us of what he did in London apart from the poetry event?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there's very little that I have found to flesh out that account. I mean, from what I've seen, he did continue to try to write, but at a much lower pace and less success, even than before. He worked at an import-export firm as a clerk, as he described it. And I don't remember in which, it's in my book, but I'm forgetting now in which part of London, but a very modest existence. All that I have is really correspondence back to authors in the United States whose prominence at the time meant that their letters and their papers would be saved and memorialized in various archives. And so what exists now is correspondence from an address in Hackney or Hornsey. Again, I'm butchering probably some of these pronunciations. Where he talks about, okay, where what he talks about what he's doing, and it sounds quite modest, but that's as far as I know.
Okay, thank you. And I think what will be the last question. We must let you get to a cup. Well, we say to a cup of tea, perhaps not on your side of the pond. Which is, Ian has said. You said, I think you'd spoken to people who had memories of him when he lived in Bradford. Can you say anything about what they said about him and how they reacted when told how, I imagine, how famous he was as a writer?
There's so much to talk about here, but the main thing that was communicated to me was how self-deprecating and precisely how not self-promoting. He was a mystery. People didn't really know why he was in Bradford or what he was doing there. There was some suspicion, in fact, that he was working for the Foreign Service or that he had some role in the war effort. some of the locals in Ivy Terrace knew that he was a journalist and that he was writing things for Black periodicals back in the United States. But no one had any idea really about his prominence. And I think he was one of the only, if not the only, Black resident of what was then a quite small town. It probably still is, of about 4,000 residents. So, I wouldn't call him completely reclusive, but as one of the people I spoke with was Mr. John Cottle, who at the point that he lived on Ivy Terrace was, I think he said, around 8 years old. And he said, oh, it took him a while to remember, but he said, oh yeah, of course I remember Mr. Walrond, because he rented a house from a woman whose name I'm forgetting now, who was a white woman who lived in number 9. And that in itself was a bit of a scandal, but because of there were interracial, people talked, oh, maybe they were in a relationship, etc. But he said, no, he was quite friendly. He would always come around and we'd be out in the garden with the rabbits or the chickens or whatever, and he would say hello, and then that was about it. So there wasn't much that I could describe as tremendously revealing, except that he was quite modest and, I think, as many of them said, sort of kept to himself.
But I think that's quite a contrast, isn't it, from how he was when he was living in Harlem?
Absolutely. Absolutely gregarious, nightlife. Yeah. That's an astute observation, David.
And I found that the letter from 1940 you highlighted, talking about how he was a victim of depression. Obviously, the depression had kicked in between when he had left Harlem and when he arrived in Bradford. And it obviously affected him quite seriously.
Yes, it did. And I think the depression, the Great Depression, the financial depression, as I mentioned, also contributed, as it did, frankly, to his contemporaries. I mean, some of what we now understand to be the most prominent and most prolific African-American authors that were his contemporaries. I mean, Zora Neale Hurston is a great example. I don't know how prominent Zora Neale Hurston is in your neck of the woods these days, but I mean, it took Alice Walker, another more contemporary African-American novelist, to resurrect, literally to locate Zora Neale Hurston's unmarked grave in Florida, where she died penniless as a nurse and a housekeeper. And now, Hurston is, if not a household name, almost a household name in the United States among readers of American literature and certainly African-American literature. But the Great Depression was an absolute catastrophe for her career and many of these others.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there. Can I just say a huge thank you, James? Absolutely fascinating.
Well, it's been my
lots
pleasure.
of really positive comments in the chat, how much people have enjoyed your talk, and great sets of questions. So thank you again, and I hope those of you that are listening will join our talk next week as well. And if you don't come to the book club, at least download and read some of these stories, particularly the ones from the Roundway Review, have a very local relevance, and they're absolutely fascinating. So a huge thank you, James, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Pleasure's been mine. Thank you all so much. Great privilege to spend time with you.